It started with the barbed wire. One morning, I stepped out to water my lawn, coffee in hand, only to find gleaming, razor-sharp strands of metal stretched along the edge of my property. At first, I thought it was some kind of bizarre prank until I saw her. Karen. She stood across the street, arms folded, lips pressed into a self-satisfied smirk. HOA royalty, the self-appointed ruler of our quiet cul-de-sac, the woman who monitored our trash bins for violations and took photos of slightly overgrown lawns to send out passive-aggressive emails about community standards. I set my coffee down on the porch railing and marched toward the wire. The metal glinted ominously in the early morning sun, wrapping around wooden stakes she had clearly hammered into my property line. I turned and locked eyes with her. Karen, what the hell is this? She made a show of checking her smartwatch before sighing dramatically. Good morning, neighbor. She said the word as if it left a bad taste in her mouth. That, sir, is a security measure. The HOA board agreed that our neighborhood has been looking vulnerable lately. I crossed my arms, my voice steady. And you thought barbed wire on my property would fix that? Karen waved her hand dismissively. Oh, please, don't be so melodramatic. I saw your little "beware of dog" sign. Clearly, you're concerned about security too. Think of this as an upgrade. My jaw clenched. I knew better than to argue with her when she got like this. Karen operated in a world of delusions where everything she did was for the greater good, and questioning her made you an uncooperative member of the community. I inhaled sharply and stepped back, keeping my anger in check. This is my land. Take it down. Her smirk widened. Oh, I don't think so. The next evening, my golden retriever, Max, ran into the backyard as he always did. I had been careful to keep him away from the newly erected wire, but dogs are curious, and Max was no exception. I was inside, watching TV, when I heard it, his sharp yelp of pain. I bolted outside. Max stood near the fence, one paw lifted, whimpering. I knelt beside him and saw the thin, red line across his leg. Blood. Rage boiled in my chest. I grabbed my phone and took a dozen photos of the injury, the wire, and the exact spot where it happened. Then, without hesitation, I called Animal Services. The operator listened patiently as I explained what had happened. Her voice took on a concerned edge. Barbed wire on residential property? That doesn't sound legal. I'm dispatching an officer immediately. 15 minutes later, a white van with the county's animal control logo pulled up. A middle-aged officer with tired eyes stepped out and shook my hand. I showed him the wound on Max's paw and the wire stretching across my property. He frowned. This looks bad. I'm going to file an official report. He took pictures, jotted down notes, and then, to my satisfaction, walked straight across the street to Karen's house. I watched from my porch as she answered the door. She listened, arms crossed, nodding occasionally, then suddenly threw up her hands and started ranting. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the way the officer's posture shifted, firm, unmoved. Eventually, he turned on his heel and walked away, ignoring her protests. He came back to me and sighed. She claims it's for security, but this is a hazard. I'm escalating this to the city. Karen was still standing in her doorway, fuming. When our eyes met, she pointed a manicured finger at me. Oh, you're really going to regret this. I smiled. We'll see. The next morning, I had another visitor, the city inspector. A short, stocky man with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude. He took one look at the barbed wire and shook his head. Unpermitted hazardous fencing. That's a violation of city code. He snapped pictures, checked his notes, and then knocked on Karen's door. The moment she saw him, she launched into another tirade, but he simply held up his hand. Ma'am, this is not up for discussion. You've installed a dangerous structure on someone else's property, without permission and without a permit. Karen scoffed. I am the HOA. We have rules in place for security measures, and... He cut her off. The city does not recognize HOA authority when it contradicts municipal regulations. I nearly laughed out loud at the way her face paled. The inspector handed her a citation and pointed at the wire. This must be removed immediately. If it's still here in 24 hours, you'll face additional fines. Karen sputtered, flipping through the pages of the citation as if she could will the words to disappear. Meanwhile, I stood on my lawn, arms crossed, and simply watched. Karen didn't take defeat well. That night, I heard something outside. Peering through the blinds, I spotted her in the dim glow of her porch light, whispering to someone. Moments later, a group of teenagers, probably local troublemakers she had recruited, began dragging trash cans onto my driveway, scattering garbage everywhere. I grabbed my phone and hit record. The next morning, before Karen could even wipe the smug grin off her face, I forwarded the video straight to the city. An hour later, another citation was pinned to her door. And the best part? She had to clean up every last piece of trash herself. The barbed wire was gone. The citations had been issued. Karen had suffered a humiliating loss. But something told me she wasn't finished yet. As I sipped my coffee on the porch, watching her glare at me from across the street, I knew one thing for sure: this war between neighbors was just beginning. And I was ready for whatever she had planned next. For a brief moment, life returned to normal. Karen sulked for a few days after the city inspector forced her to remove the barbed wire, and I naively thought she might finally back off. But that peace was short-lived. Exactly 1 week later, I received a letter from the city. At first, I assumed it was a follow-up regarding Karen's violation, maybe even confirmation that she had paid her fine. But as I read the document, my stomach twisted. Notice of code violation. Subject: unpermitted structure and landscaping violations. It has come to our attention that your property is in violation of municipal code due to unapproved modifications, including, but not limited to, excessive lawn overgrowth, unauthorized fencing materials, improperly stored waste bins. You are required to remedy these issues within 7 days to avoid penalties. I clenched my fists. This was Karen's doing. There was no way my lawn was in violation. I maintained it regularly, and it was easily one of the better-kept yards in the neighborhood. My fence had been in place for years, approved long before Karen even moved in. As for the waste bins, they were neatly stored behind my house. This wasn't about actual violations. This was retaliation. I wasted no time. I called the city office listed on the notice and asked for clarification. The woman on the phone sounded confused. We received multiple complaints from an anonymous source, she admitted. I almost laughed. Anonymous, my ass. I calmly requested an inspection to prove my property was in compliance. She agreed and scheduled a visit for 2 days later. As I hung up, I glanced across the street. Karen stood at her window, arms crossed, watching me. She knew exactly what she had done, and she thought she'd get away with it. The city inspector arrived on time, clipboard in hand. I greeted him and let him survey the property. He took a slow walk around my yard, measuring the grass, checking my fence, and peeking at my waste bins. After about 15 minutes, he returned, shaking his head. "You're fine," he said. "This is a textbook case of a nuisance complaint." I exhaled. "So what happens now?" He flipped through his paperwork. "Normally, we'd issue a warning, but since there's no actual violation, I'll be closing the case." I smirked. "And what about the person who filed the complaint?" The inspector hesitated. "I can't disclose their identity, but let's just say if someone submits multiple false reports, they could be fined for wasting city resources." My grin widened. "Good to know." I walked him out, and as soon as he drove off, I turned toward Karen's house. Sure enough, her blinds twitched. I took out my phone, snapped a picture of the now-dismissed violation notice, and sent it straight to the HOA email chain. Karen wanted to play dirty? Fine, but I was keeping receipts. A few days passed without incident, but I knew Karen wasn't done. She had too much pride to accept defeat. The next issue arose when my brother, Jake, came over to visit. He parked his truck in front of my house, completely legally, mind you. Less than an hour later, I heard a knock. Karen stood on my porch, HOA rulebook in hand. "You can't park commercial vehicles in this neighborhood," she announced. I frowned. "It's not a commercial vehicle." She sniffed. "It's a truck." I pinched the bridge of my nose. Karen, it's a personal vehicle. There's no company logo, no commercial plates. It's just a truck. She pursed her lips. Well, it's an eyesore. I'm going to have to report this to the HOA. I chuckled. Knock yourself out. Sure enough, the next day, I received an email from the HOA board. Subject: Vehicle Violation Complaint. Dear homeowner, we received a complaint regarding a commercial vehicle parked in front of your property. Please be advised that. I didn't even read the rest. I fired back a response, citing the exact HOA rule Karen was trying to twist, along with photos proving the truck was not commercial. A few hours later, another email arrived. Subject: Case closed. Upon review, no violation was found. Thank you for your compliance. I forwarded the email to Karen. No message, just the email. A few minutes later, I heard a door slam across the street. I laughed. The next blow was personal. 2 days after the parking war, I was outside playing with Max when a white van pulled up. Animal control. A young officer stepped out, clipboard in hand. Sir, we received a complaint about a dangerous dog on your property. I blinked. Excuse me? He flipped through his notes. The caller claimed your dog was aggressive, unlicensed, and a threat to the community. I felt my blood boil. Max, my golden retriever, was about as dangerous as a stuffed animal. I took a breath, forcing myself to stay calm. Would you like to meet him? The officer nodded. I let Max out, and he immediately trotted up, wagging his tail, tongue hanging out happily. The officer crouched down, letting Max sniff his hand before giving him a few pats. He seems friendly. Because he is, I said flatly. And he's registered. I can show you his paperwork. The officer smiled, shaking his head. Not necessary. I can tell this complaint was exaggerated. He gave Max one last scratch behind the ears before heading back to his van. Sorry for the trouble. As he drove off, I turned toward Karen's house. This time, I didn't just smirk. I raised my hand and waved. She yanked her blinds shut. Karen had been playing dirty from the start. False complaints. HOA rule twisting. Weaponizing city officials. It was time to turn the tables. I started documenting everything. Every time she came near my property. Every passive-aggressive note she left on my door. Every time she peered through my windows, making herself a little too interested in my business. Then, one evening, I accidentally left an official-looking letter in my mailbox, one that just so happened to be sticking out far enough to read. It was fake, of course. Notice of legal action. Due to repeated harassment and false complaints, the homeowner at my address is pursuing legal action for defamation, nuisance claims, and HOA abuse. It didn't take long. Less than 2 hours later, I saw Karen creeping out of her house, sneaking toward my mailbox. She reached for the letter, just as my security camera light clicked on. She froze. Busted. I leaned out my door, phone in hand, recording. Something you need, Karen? She stammered, then turned and bolted back into her house. I smiled. This war wasn't over. But now? I had the upper hand. Karen must have been fuming after I caught her red-handed snooping through my mailbox. But instead of backing off, she doubled down. A few days later, I found a crisp white envelope stuffed into my doorframe. No return address. No postage. Just my name, scrawled in sharp, aggressive handwriting. I opened it. Dear homeowner, your recent actions have been extremely disruptive to the peace and order of our neighborhood. Your blatant disrespect for the HOA and its regulations has been noted, and further disturbances will not be tolerated. Consider this your final warning before serious measures are taken. Signed, a concerned neighbor. I scoffed. Karen wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. This was a threat, thinly veiled, but a threat nonetheless. Instead of getting angry, I took the letter inside, snapped a picture, and sent it to the HOA board with a simple message. Subject: harassment concern. I received this anonymous letter today. I assume the HOA has nothing to do with it, but given recent events, I wanted to make you aware. Looking forward to your response. Then I waited. Sure enough, within the hour, I got a reply from a board member, not Karen, but a guy named Mark who actually seemed reasonable. Subject: harassment concern. This is deeply concerning. The HOA does not condone anonymous threats against residents. I'll bring this up at the next meeting. Please keep us updated if anything else happens. Translation: Karen was about to have a very awkward conversation with the board. I smiled. A week later, the HOA held an open meeting at the local community center. Normally, I ignored these gatherings, but this time, I made a point to attend. When I walked in, I saw Karen already seated at the front, her usual smug expression firmly in place. She shot me a death glare. I just smiled and took a seat near the back. Mark, the board member who responded to my email, stood up and cleared his throat. Before we move on to regular business, we need to address a serious issue. A homeowner received an anonymous letter threatening action against them for supposed disruptions to the neighborhood. That's completely unacceptable. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen's face twitched. Mark continued, "If anyone here has knowledge of who might have sent this letter, now is the time to speak up." Dead silence. Karen shifted uncomfortably. I could see the gears turning in her head. She wanted to deny it, but she knew that if she did, and someone exposed her later, she'd be screwed. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, waiting. Finally, she scoffed. Well, maybe if certain people didn't cause problems, there wouldn't be a need for such communications. Gasps. Oh, she really just admitted it. Mark's eyes narrowed. Are you saying you were involved, Karen? She quickly backtracked. Of course not. I'm just saying that some people constantly challenge the HOA's authority, and that breeds frustration. Mark sighed. Regardless, if we find out who sent that letter, they'll face consequences. Karen clamped her mouth shut. I knew she'd just been put on notice. After the meeting, Karen mostly avoided me. But just because she stayed quiet didn't mean she wasn't scheming. About a week later, I woke up to a loud thud against my house. When I stepped outside, I found my garbage bins knocked over, trash scattered everywhere. Classic Karen. Luckily, my security cameras caught everything. I watched the footage, unsurprised to see Karen herself creeping onto my lawn in the middle of the night, tipping over the bins with a look of pure spite. I could have confronted her directly. But where was the fun in that? Instead, I sent the video straight to the city, along with a complaint about illegal dumping on private property. The result? Karen received a $500 fine for littering. When she found out, she stormed over to my house, red-faced and furious. "You think this is funny?" she shrieked. I leaned against my door frame. "A little, yeah. You had no right to." I cut her off. "Actually, Karen, I had every right. You trespassed on my property and left trash everywhere. That's illegal." She opened her mouth, then snapped it shut, fists clenched. I stepped closer and lowered my voice. "You started this. You installed barbed wire on my property. You filed fake complaints. You sent threats. And now that it's coming back on you, you can't handle it." Her eyes burned with hatred. "You're going to regret this." I smiled. "We'll see." Then I shut the door in her face. Karen had spent years ruling over the HOA like a dictator. But after months of her ridiculous antics, people were starting to turn against her. The final straw came when she tried to raise HOA fees again. A neighbor named Linda, who had been on the board for years, had finally had enough. She started a petition to remove Karen as HOA president. The moment I heard about it, I signed it. Within a week, the petition had over 50 signatures, more than enough to trigger a recall vote. Karen lost her mind. She went door to door, trying to convince people not to sign. She sent desperate emails about how the neighborhood needed strong leadership. She even tried bribing a few people with promises of special rule exemptions. None of it worked. The vote was scheduled. On the night of the meeting, Karen walked in looking like she was heading to her own execution. When the final count came in, the result was undeniable. Karen was officially removed from the HOA board. Her face was priceless. She stood there, fists clenched, jaw tight, as the reality of her downfall sank in. When it was over, she stormed out without a word. And just like that, the reign of HOA Karen was over. With Karen gone, the neighborhood finally started to relax. The petty fine stopped. The ridiculous restrictions eased. And best of all, the HOA actually started working for the community instead of against it. Karen, of course, wasn't done being bitter. For a while, she still shot me death glares from across the street. She left nasty comments on the neighborhood Facebook page. She even tried filing another false complaint against me, only for it to backfire when the city warned her about repeated nuisance reports. Eventually, she put her house up for sale. The day she moved out, I stood on my porch, watching as the moving truck pulled away. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt peaceful. Max trotted up beside me, wagging his tail. I scratched behind his ears and smiled. "Looks like we won, buddy." He barked happily. And just like that, the war with Karen was finally over.